In 1933, a French colonial survey team mapping irrigation routes for agricultural expansion in southern Algeria photographed something from a biplane that should not have existed. The expedition leader was Captain Maurice Charbonneau, assigned to assess water resources for planned cotton cultivation. His crew flew low over dunes near what is now the border with Mali. The photographs they took that afternoon showed something beneath 40 feet of sand that matched no known settlement pattern in North Africa. A geometric grid of stone foundations stretched 11 miles in perfect cardinal alignment. The aerial images were clear enough to see foundation walls at regular 50-meter intervals, stone channels in radial patterns suggesting water distribution, and central plaza structures measuring 200 meters per side. Not Roman, not Islamic, not matching any architectural tradition the survey team had been trained to identify. The photographs were filed in the Ministry of Colonies archive in Paris with a two-line notation: anomalous subsurface geometry, no historical precedent identified. No excavation was authorized. Captain Charbonneau was reassigned to administrative duty in Marseille within 6 months. The site coordinates were removed from subsequent survey maps, published after 1934. The standard story about the Sahara says the desert has been arid for roughly 5,000 years. Before that, savanna, lakes, rivers, human habitation in scattered Neolithic settlements, rock art, some pottery, then gradual abandonment as the climate shifted toward the conditions we recognize today. The archaeological narrative is clean. No large-scale urban development, no centralized architecture, no organized infrastructure, no reason to expect anything systematic beneath the sand. What Charbonneau's photographs actually showed was planned infrastructure on a scale that should not exist in the accepted timeline. The depth of sand coverage indicated a burial time frame of approximately 3,200 to 4,000 years. That meant construction during or slightly before the aridification period. Someone built city-scale infrastructure, either knowing the water was disappearing or while the Sahara was still green. Either scenario required a level of social organization the textbooks say did not exist in this region during that period. This is where the official story begins to fracture. Charbonneau kept a field journal, archived separately from his official reports. His private notes describe stone cut too precisely for the hand tools supposedly available in the period. He sketched the foundation joints, interlocking, no mortar, with deliberate thermal expansion gaps. He noted something else that troubled him. The grid was not oriented to any known trade route, river system, or coastline. It was oriented 23.5 degrees off true north, the axial tilt of the Earth. One photograph was catalogued but never published. It shows a stone block partially excavated from the sand. The chisel marks visible in the image matched no known regional tool tradition. Charbonneau's journal entries shift in tone over the 3 weeks he spent documenting the site. Early entries read like standard archaeological curiosity. Later entries begin asking different questions. The standard framing would ask what culture built this. Charbonneau began asking what economic or territorial function required this scale and precision in a place about to become uninhabitable. He writes, "The grid is too large for local agriculture. The alignment is too precise for ritual. The abandonment is too complete." Then, in a margin note dated the 19th of April, 1933, "This was not built for the people who lived there. It was built for extraction or transit." 2 months after Charbonneau's reassignment, the French Ministry of Colonies commissioned a separate geological survey of the same region. The official purpose was to assess mineral potential. The survey team included a mining engineer, not an archaeologist. They mapped subsurface density using seismic reflection technology, an early geophysical method that was rare for civilian use at the time. The results were filed under industrial confidentiality protocols, not public science archives. What this reveals is not that the government failed to understand what Charbonneau had found. It reveals they understood immediately and moved to assess it economically rather than historically. The pattern becomes clearer when you track French colonial administrative records from the 1920s through the 1940s. Multiple notations appear across North and West Africa describing anomalous subsurface features. The bureaucratic response is consistent. Sites are photographed, but not excavated. Reports are reclassified from archaeological to economic or strategic assessment. Site coordinates are often omitted from published maps, with personnel involved in the discoveries are frequently reassigned or retired shortly afterward. What appears in the historical record as lost archaeology was often reclassified as territorial infrastructure potential. The question stops being about ancient mystery. It starts being about administrative conversion, how institutions transformed historical knowledge into economic leverage. Between 1928 and 1956, French colonial geological surveys identified at least 43 subsurface geometric anomalies across the Sahara and Sahel regions. Only 7 were ever published in archaeological literature. The other 36 were transferred to military or economic ministry files. Cross-reference those coordinates with post-independence negotiations in the 1960s. Many of the unpublished sites overlap precisely with resource concession zones that France retained in independence agreements. This is the number that changes the scale. 43 sites, 7 made public, 36 reclassified and used in territorial negotiations decades later. The Charbonneau grid itself was never excavated by the French. But in 1957, during the Algerian War of Independence, French military engineers built a supply depot exactly on top of the 1933 coordinates. Construction records describe pre-existing subsurface stone structures used as foundation support. The depot was functional for 5 years. By 1962, with Algerian independence, the facility was abandoned. By 1973, the site was buried again under advancing dunes. If the French already knew the infrastructure was there and used it for military purposes, what did the geological surveys find at the other 42 sites? And who controls access to them now? Charbonneau's journal contains one additional detail that did not appear in any official report. On his final day at the site, his team excavated a small section of one foundation wall to assess construction methods. Beneath the first layer of stone blocks, they found a secondary foundation layer built from a different material, vitrified clay bricks, fired at temperatures that required kilns, not open fires. The bricks bore pressure marks, suggesting industrial-scale production. He photographed them. The photographs are catalogued in the same Paris archive. They have never been displayed publicly. The journal entry for that day reads, "We are not looking at a single settlement. We are looking at supply chain evidence. Kilns, standardized materials, coordinated construction. This was not ritual. This was not subsistence agriculture. This was organized production for export or consolidation." Then the expedition ended. Charbonneau flew back to Algiers. Within 3 weeks, he received notice of reassignment. What stops this from being ancient history is what happened next. The site coordinates were not forgotten. They were preserved in restricted files and used strategically for half a century. The difference between public archaeology and classified geology is not about knowledge. It is about utility. If a site remains unpublished and unexcavated, it cannot become protected cultural heritage under international conventions. It remains administratively flexible. It can be classified as a geological feature. It can be cited as evidence of prior development in resource extraction agreements. It can be built over. It can be used as legal justification for territorial claims. And it can remain that way indefinitely because the original discovery was never released into the public record. The machinery here is not suppression, it is conversion. History that enters the public archive becomes symbolically valuable but legally constrained. History that remains in restricted ministry files becomes strategically flexible. Charbonneau understood this by the end of his final week at the site. His journal closes with a passage written the night before he left. "I have mapped something that will never be interpreted as what it is. The stones will remain, the photographs will remain, but the meaning will be assigned by people who were not here, based on needs that have nothing to do with the people who built this. What we found will be used, but it will not be known." 90 years later, the Charbonneau grid does not appear in archaeological databases, but the coordinates appear on mineral concession maps filed with the Algerian Ministry of Energy. The record was filed, just not where anyone looking for history would think to search. The story is no longer about what ancient people built beneath the Sahara. It is about how modern institutions decided what could be known publicly and what needed to remain administratively ambiguous. The shift matters because it changes every fact that came before. In 1958, UNESCO launched the international campaign to save the monuments of Nubia. The Aswan High Dam construction in Egypt threatened to flood dozens of ancient temples along the Nile. The international response was immediate and massive. 22 nations contributed funding. Archaeologists, engineers, and photographers descended on the region. Entire temple complexes were documented, disassembled, and relocated stone by stone. Abu Simbel, Philae. The campaign became a defining moment in global heritage preservation. Same decade, same region, same institutional players. Yet no comparable effort was made for the 43 Saharan subsurface sites identified in French geological surveys. The Nubian temples were visible, globally famous, and symbolically valuable. The Saharan grids were invisible, unknown to public science, and potentially resource-rich. That difference determined everything. The Nubian campaign succeeded because the sites had no competing economic claim. They were monuments, stone, and history. Their value was entirely symbolic, which made them safe to rescue. The Saharan sites had a different problem. They sat on top of mineral deposits that French geological surveys had already assessed and documented in confidential files. Archaeological ambiguity turned out to be more useful than archaeological clarity. Post-independence resource agreements between France and former colonies in the 1960s and 70s contain specific legal language that reveals the machinery. France retained mineral rights in zones described as predating colonial occupation or showing prior development or infrastructure use. The language required proving historical French survey investment region without requiring public disclosure of what the surveys had actually found. The unexcavated sites became documentation. If a site remained unpublished, it could be classified as a geological feature rather than cultural heritage. That kept it outside UNESCO jurisdiction. It kept it inside economic treaty frameworks. It allowed the physical site to function as legal evidence of prior activity without ever being explained as an archaeological discovery. This is the hidden function. Forgetting was not accidental. It was structured. Track the institutional pathway clearly. Discovery phase, 1920s through 1930s. Sites documented and filed as archaeological anomalies in ministry archives. Reclassification phase, 1930s through 1940s. Reports transferred from public science files to geological and strategic assessment divisions. Strategic use phase, 1950s. Military infrastructure built directly on top of documented sites, using pre-existing foundations as structural support. Legal utility phase, 1960s. Site coordinates cited in resource retention agreements as evidence of prior French territorial development. Erasure phase, 1970s to present. Coordinates removed from public databases, excavation permits denied or delayed indefinitely, sites reburied by natural sand movement or restricted access. The pattern is not accidental forgetting. It is managed non-disclosure with legal and economic function. Consider the contrast again from another angle. Colonial archaeology in Africa is often described as incomplete due to limited resources, difficult terrain, or lack of trained personnel. That explanation assumes institutional neutrality. It assumes the goal was knowledge, and the obstacle was capacity. But the evidence suggests colonial archaeology was selectively incomplete. Sites with symbolic value and no resource conflict were studied and published. Sites with economic potential were surveyed, documented in restricted files, and left legally ambiguous. Post-independence nations are often described as gaining sovereignty over cultural heritage through treaties and international agreements. That explanation assumes heritage and resources were treated as unified categories, but the institutional record shows they were separated through bureaucratic classification. Cultural heritage became the domain of UNESCO, education ministries, and public museums. Resource extraction remained the domain of mining concessions, economic treaties, and confidential geological assessments. The separation was administrative, but the effect was territorial. The Sahara's ancient history is often described as mysterious due to harsh excavation conditions, vast distances, and political instability. That explanation assumes the mystery is environmental. But portions of that history remain unexcavated because accessibility would require legal reclassification. A site cannot be simultaneously a protected heritage zone and an active mining concession. As long as the archaeological status remains unresolved, the economic status remains flexible. In 1982, French geologist Henri Lotte published a survey of Saharan archaeological potential. Lotte was known for his work documenting the Tassili Nadja rock art in Algeria. His 1982 publication mentions unexplained subsurface geometries in southern Algeria and northern Mali in a single paragraph. He notes the features merit further investigation and suggests they may represent pre-Islamic trade infrastructure or water management systems. No follow-up studies were funded. No international archaeological teams were granted permits for those specific coordinates. Applications were filed. Requests were submitted through proper channels. Responses were delayed, deferred, or denied on grounds of regional instability, insufficient local infrastructure, or budgetary limitations. Meanwhile, mining surveys in the same regions continued without interruption. The silence is structural. Academic archaeology requests encounter administrative friction. Commercial geological surveys proceed through different approval systems and face different thresholds. The two domains operate in parallel with minimal overlap. The question opens wider here. If 43 sites were identified by one colonial power in one region, how many similar reclassifications occurred globally across the colonial period? British geological and archaeological surveys in Sudan and Kenya, 1920s through 1950s. Belgian surveys in Congo, 1930s through 1960s. Portuguese surveys in Angola and Mozambique, 1940s through 1970s. The administrative structure was similar. Survey teams documented sites. Reports were filed in metropolitan archives. Some findings were published in scientific journals. Others were transferred to economic or strategic ministries. The larger question is whether selective archaeological forgetting was a widespread administrative practice wherever ancient infrastructure overlapped with modern resource extraction zones. The design, when you see it clearly, was elegant. Survey everything. Publish what was symbolically valuable or politically safe. Reclassify what was economically strategic. Use the reclassified sites as legal evidence of prior development in resource negotiations. Allow burial, erosion, or restricted access to prevent independent verification. The utility of forgetting is not ignorance, it is managed ambiguity. What looks like gaps in the historical record often functioned as gaps in the public record while remaining detailed in restricted institutional files. The information was not lost, it was compartmentalized. Return to Charbonneau's 1933 photograph, the one showing the geometric grid beneath the sand. What it appeared to be at the time was a mysterious lost civilization. What it actually represented was an asset in a longer game of territorial consolidation. The photograph was filed, not published. The coordinates were used, not shared. The excavation was prevented, not forgotten. Somewhere in a Parisian ministry basement, assuming the archives have not been relocated or digitized, there is a file folder labeled Anomalous Subsurface Geometry, Southern Algeria, 1933. Next to it, or possibly in an adjacent filing cabinet in a different building, there is a geological survey marked Strategic Resource Assessment, Region 7, South, Confidential, 1934. They describe the same 11-mile grid. One was never opened to archaeology, the other was never closed to extraction. Charbonneau died in 1961 in Marseille. His obituary in the regional newspaper identified him as a retired colonial administrator. It made no mention of the 1933 expedition. His field journals were donated to a public archive in 1974 by his daughter. They are available to researchers by appointment. Almost no one has requested them. The Sahara holds thousands of years of human history beneath its sand. Some of it has been studied, some of it has been surveyed, and some of it has been administratively separated from the category of history altogether. The question is not what ancient peoples built. The question is what modern institutions decided was more valuable left buried and legally ambiguous than excavated and publicly known. Charbonneau photographed a grid in 1933. 90 years later, those coordinates still do not appear on archaeological databases maintained by universities or heritage organizations. But they do appear on mineral concession maps filed with the Algerian Ministry of Energy and accessible through commercial geological databases. The record was filed, just not where anyone looking for history would think to search.